A girl placed her bleeding hand against a surface of clay in the darkness, and the clay was warm. Outside the cabin walls, wind screamed at a pitch she had never heard before, a sound like sheet metal tearing, like the earth itself splitting open at the seams. The temperature had dropped so fast that a cup of water on the floor had frozen solid while she watched, the surface glazing over in a matter of minutes, then cracking as the ice expanded. 11 people lay pressed together on the thing the whole county had been calling her mud coffin. A farmer who had laughed at her in August, a preacher who had warned his congregation about pagan knowledge, a man who had bet money she would be dead before the new year, a 4-year-old girl whose lips had been blue when her grandfather carried her through the door. All of them breathing, all of them warm. The clay held. The earth remembered what iron had forgotten, that heat was not something to be wasted on the air, but something to be stored, held close, released slowly through the longest night. This is the story of how it was built. 5 months earlier, in the dead heat of summer, a train deposited 2 young people at a siding that barely deserved a name. But before the train, before the prairie, before any of it, there was a room. A narrow room on the 3rd floor of a brick tenement in a city back east, where the air smelled of lye soap and coal smoke, and 2 orphans lived in the space their grandmother had left behind. Saren Lindmark was 19 years old. She worked 6 days a week in a commercial laundry, feeding sheets through a mangle press that had already taken the tip of one woman's finger and the hearing in another woman's left ear. The work was hot, mindless, and it paid just enough to keep the room if she also took in mending on Sundays. Her hands were rough from the chemicals. Her back ached in a way that had become so constant she no longer noticed it, the way a person stops hearing a clock that has been ticking long enough. She had ash-blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid that never came loose, no matter how long the shift ran. Gray eyes that had learned not to show too much. A face that was not beautiful and not plain, but somewhere in the territory between. The kind of face that people trusted without knowing exactly why. Her brother Kettle was 17 and still growing into his height. Brown-haired where she was fair, uncertain where she was steady. He loaded freight at the harbor docks 4 days a week and spent the other 3 looking for work that would make the 4th day unnecessary. He had their father's jawline and their grandmother's stubborn silence, and he carried both like weights he had not yet learned to set down. When he laughed, which was rare now, the sound came out startled, as though he had surprised himself by remembering that laughter was something his body still knew how to do. Their grandmother had died 3 months earlier. Pneumonia. Quick at the end, slow in the middle, the way those things always went. She had been born in a valley in Norway where the winters lasted 8 months and the sun barely cleared the mountains even in June. And she had carried that valley with her across an ocean, across a continent, into a 3rd-floor room where she raised 2 grandchildren who had nowhere else to go. Every evening after supper, in the years when Seren was young enough to sit at her grandmother's feet and old enough to remember what she heard, the old woman would open a leather notebook and talk about the old country. Not with nostalgia, not with the soft-focused sentimentality of someone romanticizing the past, She spoke about it the way an engineer speaks about a bridge, with precision, with respect for the forces involved, with an understanding that failure meant death and success meant another winter survived. The notebook was filled with drawings, precise and careful, of structures Seren did not fully understand at the time. Thick walls made of clay and stone, channels that snaked through raised platforms like veins through a body, fireboxes with throats that narrowed and widened like the neck of an hourglass. And always, beside the drawings, notes in a hand that mixed Norwegian and English without apology. Iron lets heat escape. Clay holds heat in. A fire inside a heavy mass transfers its warmth to the mass itself, and the mass releases that warmth slowly, evenly, long after the flames have died. The old woman had tapped the page with one gnarled finger. The houses in my grandmother's village had no iron stoves. Iron was too expensive, too precious. But they had something better. What? Young Seren had asked. Earth. Her grandmother had smiled, remembering. They built beds from clay and stone with fire chambers inside. The fire would burn for an hour, and the clay would hold the heat all night. The family would sleep on top, warm as summer, while the snow piled higher than the roof outside. That is not possible, Seren had said. She was 8 years old and endlessly certain about the boundaries of possibility. Everything is possible, child. You just have to know how. After the funeral, Seren had gone through the room with the careful attention of someone who knows that small things are the only things left. She gave away the clothes. She sold the furniture, what little there was. She kept the notebook. She did not know why, not fully. It was not useful. It described techniques for a world that no longer existed, knowledge from a country she had never seen, solutions to problems she did not have. But it had been her grandmother's most treasured possession, the thing she reached for every evening, the way other women reached for a Bible or a photograph. And Seren could not bring herself to leave it behind. She carried it everywhere. She read it at night when the room was quiet and the city pressed against the windows with its noise and light. And sometimes, in the space between waking and sleeping, she could hear her grandmother's voice reading the words aloud, explaining the drawings, making the impossible sound simple. Those were the moments when the grief eased just enough to let her breathe. Then the letter came. It arrived on a weekday morning, addressed to both of them, from a lawyer in a settlement neither of them had ever heard of. Their father, Arne Lindmark, was dead. Typhoid fever, alone in a cabin on the edge of a claim he had worked for 11 years. The letter informed them that they were the sole heirs to 160 acres of farmland and all improvements thereon. The letter did not mention that Arne Lindmark had left them when Seren was 7 years old. It did not mention that he had remarried, that he had another son, that he had built a new life while his first children grew up believing they had been forgotten. It did not mention the birthday that passed without a card, the Christmas without a letter, the slow hardening of a child's heart against a parent who chose to leave. The letter did not mention any of this. It simply stated the facts of the inheritance and provided directions for claiming it. Seren read the letter twice. She set it on the table beside the notebook. She looked at her brother, who was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she felt it herself. the complicated arithmetic of grief for someone you had every reason to hate and every reason to love, and no way to reconcile the two. They sold what little remained. They bought 2 train tickets west, and Seren packed the notebook in the bottom of their trunk. Beneath the spare clothes and the practical shoes and the small amount of money that was supposed to last until they found their footing in a place they had never seen and could not imagine. The platform was nothing more than weathered boards laid across packed earth. There was no town visible, no junction, nothing but prairie grass stretching to the horizon in every direction. The sky was so large it made Seren dizzy, a dome of pale blue that pressed down on the land with a weight she could feel in her chest. She had spent her entire life in a city where the sky was a narrow strip between buildings. Here, the sky was everything. It swallowed the land. It swallowed her. A man with a wagon agreed to take them the remaining 12 miles for 75 cents. He was Scandinavian from the sound of his accent, and he did not ask questions. They did not offer answers. The wagon creaked across the prairie while the summer sun pressed down on them like a hand, and the grass parted before them and closed behind them as though they had never passed through at all. Neither sibling spoke because there was nothing to say that would change what waited at the end of the road. The cabin appeared in the late afternoon, a small dark shape against the endless gold of the prairie grass. As they drew closer, Seren could see that it was rough construction, tar paper over warped boards, a door that hung crooked in its frame. A chimney rose from the roof, and the sight of it gave her a moment of hope. The instinctive association between chimney and warmth, between smoke and survival, between a hole in the roof and the promise that someone had once cared enough to build a fire beneath it. The wagon driver let them off at the end of the rutted track. He accepted his 75 cents, looked at the cabin, looked at the 2 young people standing beside their trunk, and shook his head slowly. "God help you," he said, and drove away. Seren stood in the doorway and counted what the room contained. A dirt floor, packed hard but uneven. 4 walls of rough-hewn timber with gaps visible between the boards where the wind would find its way through. A roof that let light through in 3 places. A window facing east, the glass cracked but intact. Empty shelves nailed to one wall. A chimney hole cut through the roof, ringed with tin, sized for a pipe 6 inches across. No bed, no table, no chairs, no stove. She walked to the chimney hole and looked up. The tin flashing was sound. She could see pale sky through the opening, a coin of light that would let in rain, let in snow, let in cold. But there was nothing beneath it. She knelt and examined the floor. 4 shallow depressions forming a rectangle in the packed dirt. The marks where a stove had stood. The dirt around them slightly cleaner, protected from foot traffic by the stove's bulk. Someone had removed it recently. The earth had not yet settled back into the depressions. Her heart, which had been holding steady through the long journey, through the grief and the uncertainty and the 1,000 miles of unknown, began to sink. Kettle's voice came from outside, strange and tight. Seren. She stepped through the crooked door and found him standing at the edge of the grass, staring at a man on horseback who had appeared from the open prairie like something the land itself had produced. The man was perhaps 30, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that held no warmth. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who had grown up in the saddle, and he looked down at them with an expression Saren recognized immediately. But beneath the contempt, beneath the hardness, there was something else. Something that looked, if you knew where to look, like hunger. The hunger of a child who had been sitting at a table his whole life, watching his father's love leave the room and travel 1,000 miles to children who were not there. "You are the children from back east," he said. It was not a question. Saren straightened. She met his gaze without flinching, though something in the set of his jaw, the shape of his brow, sent a jolt of recognition through her chest. He looked like their father. Not exactly. Not the way siblings look alike, but the way a riverbed looks like the river that carved it. The same structure underneath, shaped by different weather. "I am Saren Lindmark," she said. "This is my brother Kettle. Our father was Arna Lindmark. I know who your father was." The man's voice was flat, but there was something beneath the flatness, something that sounded less like contempt than like a wound that had scarred over badly. "I am Theron, his son, his real son." The words landed hard. Saren felt Kettle stiffen beside her. "The lawyer said we were his only heirs," she said. "The lawyer said what the will told him to say." Theron shifted in his saddle, and for a moment the mask slipped. His voice changed, became something raw, something closer to the bone. "Your father wrote to you every week for 12 years. Letters to children he left behind, children he never saw, children he loved so much he could not stop writing to them even when the letters came back unopened." He paused. The horse shifted beneath him. The prairie wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. "He never wrote to me. Not once. I sat across the table from him every morning for 15 years, and he never once wrote me a letter. He saved all that love for the children who were not there." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. Then the mask came back. Theron's face hardened, the vulnerability sealed away behind something colder and more familiar. "The stove was my mother's," he said. "When she died, it came to me. I have already sold it. The bed, the table, the tools, all of it came from my mother's family. All of it belongs to me now." "You left us with nothing," Saren said. "You have the cabin. You have the land. The law says that much, at least until the court sees reason." Theron gathered his reins. "You are welcome to stay. If you can survive until spring, we will settle the matter in front of a judge." He looked at the cabin, at the chimney that led to nothing, at the two young people who had traveled 1,000 miles to claim a dead man's empty room. "But I do not think you will survive," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite satisfaction, something that sounded almost like regret. Two city children with no stove, no supplies, no idea what the winter can do out here. My father never should have put you in that will. He should have let you go." "Why do you think he did not?" Serene asked. Theron looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away without answering. And Saren stood in the grass and watched him go. And she did not hate him. That was the strange thing. She had expected to hate whoever had taken the stove, whoever had tried to strip the cabin of everything that might have kept them alive. But Theron had shown her something she had not been prepared for. He had shown her his wound, and his wound was the mirror image of her own. A father who loved the wrong children, who poured his heart into letters that never arrived, while the child beside him starved for a single word. Saren. Kettle's voice was tight, almost breaking. We should go back, sell the land, take whatever money we can get. And do what? Live where? Work at what? She shook her head. We have nothing back there, Kettle. Less than nothing. At least here we have a roof. A roof with no stove beneath it. You heard him. We will freeze before the new year. Maybe. Saren looked at the cabin, at the chimney hole that led to nothing, at the walls that let the wind through, at the floor that would turn to ice when the cold came. Maybe not. How? How exactly do you plan to heat this cabin with no stove and no money to buy one? Saren did not have an answer. Not yet. But she turned away from the horizon where Theron had vanished and walked back toward the rutted track where their trunk still sat in the afternoon sun. As she bent to grab one of the handles, she heard something. A small sound. A whimper. She straightened and looked around. The prairie grass rustled in the faint breeze. Nothing moved. Then the sound came again, weaker, from somewhere in the grass to her left. She followed it, pushing through the tall stems until she found the source. A dog. Young, but not a puppy. Gray-black fur that might have been handsome if it were not matted with dirt and something darker. One eye was missing entirely, the socket scarred over as if the wound were old. The other eye watched her approach with a mix of fear and desperate hope that she recognized, because she had been wearing it herself for months. The dog tried to rise when she knelt beside it, tried to wag its tail, but its back leg was caught in a rusted wire half buried in the ground, the metal wrapped around the limb and bitten deep. Blood, not fresh, but not yet dried, matted the fur around the wound. Easy, Saren murmured. Easy now. The dog whimpered, but did not snap when she reached for the wire. It took several minutes to work the metal free, her fingers slick with blood that was not her own. The wire resisting as though the ground did not want to give up what it had caught. When the leg came loose, the dog collapsed against her with a sigh that seemed to empty its entire body of every fear it had been carrying. What are you doing? Kettle had followed her into the grass. He looked at the dog, at the blood on her hands, and his expression shifted from confusion to resignation. The resignation of a brother who already knew how this would end. We can barely feed ourselves, he said. Then we will barely feed him too. Saren. The word carried the weight of everything he wanted to say and knew would not matter. He was trapped. Someone left him to die. She gathered the dog into her arms, lighter than he should have been, all ribs and matted fur and desperate gratitude. I am not leaving anything else to die today. She carried the dog back to the cabin and set him down in the patch of sunlight that fell through the eastern window. He lay there watching her with his one good eye, his tail making weak movements against the dirt floor. And something in the rhythm of that tail, the stubborn persistence of it, the refusal to stop even when the body had nothing left, reminded her of her grandmother. The way the old woman had kept talking about the old country, even when no one was listening. The way she had kept filling the notebook, even when there was no one left to teach. He needs a name, Saren said. Kettle stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face still pale. Fine. Call him whatever you want. Saren looked at the dog. Gray-black fur, one eye, a survivor of something terrible who was still trying to wag his tail. Fenrir, she said. His name is Fenrir. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, as if he approved. That night, Saren lay awake on the dirt floor of the cabin, her coat spread beneath her for what little padding it could offer. Her brother pressed against her side for warmth. Fenrir curled against her feet, with the trusting weight of an animal who had decided that this person was safe. The summer night was not cold, 50 degrees perhaps, but she could feel the chill rising from the earth beneath her, could feel the drafts finding their way through every gap in the walls, could feel the vast indifference of the prairie pressing against the cabin from all sides, patient, unhurried, waiting for the season to turn. And she understood, with terrible clarity, what this room would become when winter arrived. An icebox. A coffin with a door. She thought about Theron's words. Not the threat, not the contempt, but the other thing, the thing beneath. He never wrote to me. She thought about her father, who had loved his absent children so fiercely that he had starved his present one, who had poured his heart into letters that never arrived, while the boy across the table waited for a word that never came. She thought about the cruelty of love that flows in the wrong direction, and she wondered whether Theron was right about one thing at least, whether their father had made a mistake, not in leaving the land to them, but in loving them so much from so far away that he forgot to love the child standing right beside him. She thought about the stove that was gone, the warmth that had been stolen before she could even know it existed, and somewhere, in the darkest hour of the night, when the cabin was utterly still and Kettle's breathing had settled into the rhythm of exhausted sleep, and Fenrir twitched against her feet in some dog dream of running, she reached for the trunk. She opened it in the darkness, her hands finding the leather notebook by touch, the way they always did. She could not read it without light, but she did not need to read it. She had memorized the drawings years ago, traced them with her fingers so many times that the roots of the channels, the shape of the firebox, the proportions of clay to stone to straw, were etched into her hands as surely as the calluses from the mangle press. Iron lets heat escape. Clay holds heat in. Her grandmother had known something that the iron stove makers did not want anyone to remember. That heat was not a commodity to be purchased and consumed, but a force to be understood and directed. That a fire inside a heavy mass of clay and stone would transfer its warmth to the mass itself, and the mass would release that warmth slowly, evenly, long after the flames had died. A family with an iron stove burned fuel all day and all night, 8 cords of wood through a winter, maybe more. The moment the fire died, the cold crept back. But a bed of clay, heated from beneath by channels that snaked the hot exhaust back and forth before releasing it up the chimney, could hold warmth for hours. A small fire burned hot for 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening might keep the clay warm enough to sleep on safely through the entire night. She did not need to heat the air. She needed to heat the earth. And then let the earth heat her. The idea was ancient. Her grandmother had described heated platforms used in northern lands for thousands of years. The technology had kept people alive in places colder than any prairie winter, in mountains where the snow never fully melted, in valleys where the sun disappeared for months. It was not new, it was forgotten. And there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than Seren could yet articulate. But she had never built one. She had never laid a flue. She had never mixed clay for firing. She had never tested a structure that, if it failed, could fill the cabin with smoke or catch fire from within. The notebook held the principles, the drawings, the wisdom of generations. But wisdom on a page and wisdom in the hands were not the same thing. And the distance between them was measured in mistakes she had not yet made. The risk was not small. The risk was total. If it worked, she could survive the winter on a fraction of the fuel an iron stove demanded. If it failed, she would have spent her only building time on a useless pile of mud, while the autumn slipped away and the cold crept closer, and Theron waited on the horizon with the patience of a man who already knew how the story ended. She lay in the darkness, the notebook pressed against her chest, and she heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if the old woman were still alive, still sitting in the third-floor room with the evening light falling across her weathered hands. Everything is possible, child. You just have to know how. Seren did not sleep that night. Her mind was too full of calculations, measurements, possibilities, doubts that rose and fell like the breathing of the prairie outside the walls. But by the time the first light of dawn crept through the cracked window and painted a thin line of gold across the dirt floor, she had the beginnings of a plan. It was desperate. It was probably impossible. And it was absolutely her only chance. She would build a stove out of mud. She would heat the earth itself. And she would not let anyone, not Theron, not the winter, not the doubt that whispered in her own chest, not the voices of every person who would call her a fool, take this from her. The first light touched the cabin floor and found her already sitting up, the notebook open on her knees, Fenrir watching her with his one good eye, his tail moving in slow arcs against the dirt. I know, she told him. It sounds crazy. The tail thumped twice, which was more than she had gotten from anyone else so far. She closed the notebook, stood, and walked outside into the morning. The prairie stretched before her, golden and endless, the grass rippling in a breeze that carried the smell of earth and distance, and the faintest hint of something colder waiting beyond the horizon. She had less than $20. She had 10 weeks before the first freeze. She had an idea that everyone in the territory would call impossible. And she had her grandmother's notebook, warm against her hip, where she had tucked it into her waistband. The leather soft from decades of handling, the pages full of knowledge that had crossed an ocean and 3 generations to arrive at this exact moment, in this exact place, in the hands of a 19-year-old girl who had nothing left to lose and everything still to build. The nearest settlement with a general store was 8 miles northwest. Seren walked it on the 3rd morning, leaving Kettle to watch over Fenrir, who was recovering but still too weak to travel far. She left before dawn when the prairie was still gray and the grass was wet with dew that soaked through her boots before she had gone a 1/4 mile. The store was larger than she had expected, A two-story wooden building with glass windows and a painted sign. The proprietor was a man named Fritoff, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, who had been selling to homesteaders since the first wave of settlers arrived in the region decades earlier. He watched her the way a man watches someone he has already decided cannot afford what they are looking at. She examined his stoves while he watched from behind his counter. The smallest was a box heater, cast iron, no cooking surface, $14. The middle stove was a combination unit with a firebox and a flat cooking surface on top, 2 lids for pots, a small warming shelf, $19. The largest was a full range with an oven, a reservoir for heating water, nickel trim, $34. She had $22 to her name. $22 for food, for supplies, for everything that might go wrong between now and spring. The box heater, Fritoff said, watching her calculations cross her face. It will keep 1 room alive. Barely. You will cook over the fire in the box. Not comfortable, but possible. $14. That would leave her 8. What about used? She asked. Nothing in stock. I could ask around. Might take a month. Might take 2. She did not have 2 months. The first freeze could come by late autumn. The killing cold would follow before the year turned. The stovepipe, she said. How much for just the stovepipe? 6 inches, enough to reach a ceiling of 8 feet. Fritoff's eyebrows rose. You have a stove already? I have a chimney hole. He studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he cannot quite categorize. Then he pulled out a length of pipe, black iron, and laid it on the counter. 80 cents a section. You would need 2 sections, plus an elbow, plus the collar for the roof. How much total? $2.80, give or take. She bought the pipe. She bought a small bag of flour, a pound of salt pork, a tin of matches, a bag of dried beans. She counted out the coins carefully, each one a small surrender, each one a choice that closed one door and opened another. She walked home with just over $11 remaining, a length of stovepipe under her arm, and a plan that would have made everyone in the settlement laugh if she had been foolish enough to explain it. On the walk home, she found herself talking to the pipe, to the prairie, to the empty sky above. You will see, she said. You will all see. The words sounded braver than she felt, but she said them anyway, because sometimes saying a thing out loud is the first step toward making it true. And sometimes the prairie is the only audience willing to listen without judgment. She found the best clay deposit a quarter mile from the cabin, in a low area where runoff collected in the wet season. The topsoil was thin, and beneath it the clay was dense, gray-brown, and sticky when she dug into it with a shovel she had found in the tall grass behind the cabin. Rusted, but still usable. The handle was cracked. She wrapped it with strips of cloth torn from a shirt she could no longer afford to wear. She worked in the early mornings and the late afternoons, avoiding the heat of midday when the sun pressed down on the prairie like a hot iron on linen. The work was brutal, in a way that the laundry had never been. The laundry had been monotonous, exhausting, soul-deadening, but it had been indoors, on a flat floor, with walls that kept the wind out. This was different. This was her body against the earth itself, prying clay from ground that did not want to give it up, hauling it in buckets that grew heavier with every trip, stacking it beside the cabin in a pile that grew so slowly she sometimes wondered whether she was making progress at all. Kettle helped now, though his movements carried the stiffness of a person doing work they did not believe in. He hauled clay without complaint, but he did not ask questions about the design. He did not look at the notebook. He worked beside her the way a man rows a boat he suspects is sinking, steady, mechanical, waiting for the moment when the water rises above the gunnels and proves him right. Fenrir watched them from the grass nearby. His wounded leg was healing, though he still limped. He had filled out a little on the scraps they could spare, and his coat had begun to lose its matted dullness. He followed Saren everywhere now, a gray-black shadow that seemed to understand, on some level deeper than language, that she had saved his life, and that his life was now hers to direct. By the end of the first week, the pile of clay outside the cabin reached Kettle's waist. By the end of the second week, they had twice that amount. Saren's hands were raw, where the shovel had worn through skin. Her back ached in places she had not known could ache. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, her clothes hanging looser on a frame that had never carried extra flesh to begin with. But she had clay. The neighbor closest to their claim was a man named Osmond Dahl. He lived 2 miles to the east, in a proper farmhouse, with a proper barn, and a proper iron stove that had been heating his home for 15 years. He was 58 years old, widowed, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many winters and too many graves. He came to visit on the 4th day. Saren was in the yard, gathering stones from the field when he arrived. Fenrir lying in the grass nearby, with his one good eye tracking her every movement. Osmond stopped his wagon and looked at her. He looked at the stones. He looked at the cabin with its chimney that led to nothing. "You are the Lindmark children," he said. "The ones from back east." "I am Saren. My brother Kettle is inside." "I knew your father." Osmond climbed down from the wagon with the stiffness of a man whose joints had absorbed too many cold mornings. "Knew your stepmother, too, before she died. Knew Theron when he was young enough that there might have been hope for him." He said it flatly, without cruelty, the way a man might observe that a bridge was washed out or a well had gone dry. A statement of fact, delivered without embellishment, because embellishment would have been a waste of everyone's time. "You have no stove," he said. "I can see the chimney from here. No smoke, no heat." Theron took everything that was not nailed down, and some things that were. "We know." "Then you know you will die out here. A cabin without heat in a winter like the ones we get is a coffin with a door." He looked at the pile of stones, his brow furrowing. "What are you building?" "A stove," Saren said. "A stone stove?" "A clay stove. A heated bed, actually. Firebox on one end, channels running through a clay platform. The heat trapped in the mass and released slowly through the night." Osmond stared at her as if she had started speaking in a language he did not recognize. Saren continued, because stopping would have meant acknowledging the look on his face, and she was not ready to do that. "My grandmother called them by a different name. In the old country, in Norway, they used them for centuries. Other traditions have something similar. The principle is the same everywhere. Iron lets heat escape quickly. Clay holds heat in. A fire inside a heavy clay structure transfers its warmth to the clay itself, and the clay releases that warmth slowly, evenly, long after the flames have died. Osmond was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had gone hard, not with anger, but with the certainty of a man who had buried people before and did not want to bury more. "Clay cracks," he said. "When you heat it, it cracks. When it cools, it cracks. When the weather changes, it cracks. You will have a pile of rubble before the year turns. I will mix it with straw. Let it dry slowly. Fire it gently before the real cold comes. And if the smoke backs up, if your channels clog," he shook his head, "you will poison yourself and that brother of yours before the frost has a chance to do it. I will test it before we sleep on it. You will test it." He said the words as if she had suggested testing whether fire was hot. "You have built flues before? Masonry stoves? Clay ovens?" "No." "Then you do not know what you do not know." He climbed back onto his wagon with the weariness of a man who had seen this particular kind of stubbornness before and knew exactly where it led. "You will freeze," he said, "and that brother of yours will freeze with you. I have seen it happen. I have buried people who thought they knew better than the weather." He drove away without looking back. Serene watched him go. Then she bent down, picked up another stone, and added it to the pile. The clay needed structure, flat stones for the firebox floor, larger stones for the walls of the internal channels, cobbles to mix with the clay for added thermal mass. The prairie had stones pushed up by frost and scattered across the fields for 10,000 years, but finding flat ones required searching. She walked miles in every direction, eyes on the ground, selecting stones that might have been waiting there since before anyone had thought to build anything at all. She carried them back in loads of 3 or 4, her arms burning, her legs aching. The weight of each stone, a small investment in a future she could not yet see. The design came together over 3 sleepless nights. She scratched it into the dirt floor of the cabin with a stick, erasing and redrawing until the lines made sense. The cabin was 12 feet by 10. The heated bed would run along the back wall, a raised platform 5 feet wide by 7 feet long. A firebox at one end, lined with the flattest stones she could find. 3 channels snaking the full length of the platform before rising to meet the chimney pipe she had bought in the settlement. The fire would burn at one end. The smoke would travel through the maze inside the clay, depositing heat into the mass at every turn. By the time it reached the chimney, it would be cooler, stripped of its warmth, leaving that warmth trapped in the clay beneath their bodies. She built the firebox first, laid the flat stones carefully, mortared them with clay mixed with straw, shaped the throat the way the notebook showed, narrowing it just enough to accelerate the draft. She built the first 2 channels, angling them slightly downward to encourage the flow of exhaust, packing the clay walls thick so they would hold the heat. It took a week. 7 days of work that started before dawn and ended after dark. 7 days of shaping and smoothing and testing and adjusting. 7 days of hope building in her chest like a fire that she was afraid to feed. because feeding it would make the disappointment worse if it failed. On the 8th morning, she lit a small fire in the firebox. Dry grass, small twigs, the driest scraps of wood she could find. She arranged them carefully, struck a match, and watched the flame catch. The fire grew. Smoke curled up into the throat of the firebox, into the channels beyond. And then it came back. Not slowly, not gradually. The smoke billowed out of the firebox opening in a thick gray cloud that filled the cabin in seconds. Seren's eyes burned. Her lungs seized. She could not see the door. She could not see the walls. She stumbled forward, coughing, her hands outstretched, and felt Kettle grab her arm and pull her through the doorway into the open air. They stood in the yard, both of them coughing, eyes streaming, while smoke poured from the cabin door and the cracked window, like the building itself was exhaling something poisonous it had been holding in its lungs. Fenrir had already been outside. He sat at a safe distance, watching the smoke with his one good eye, his head tilted at an angle that might have been concern, or might have been judgment. When the smoke cleared enough to go back inside, Seren examined the channels. The firebox was intact. The stones had held. But the throat was too narrow. The draft could not pull the smoke through fast enough, and instead of traveling through the channels, the exhaust had backed up and found the path of least resistance, which was straight back into the room where they would have been sleeping. And there was something else. A dead spot in the second channel, where the clay had been packed too thick on one side and too thin on the other. The heat would go around it, not through it. Even if the throat had worked, even if the draft had pulled, there would have been a cold section in the middle of the bed where the exhaust bypassed the mass entirely. The notebook had the principles. The notebook had the drawings. But the notebook did not have the exact proportions for this cabin, this clay, this altitude, this chimney height. Her grandmother had written down what she remembered, but memory is not the same as measurement, and the distance between a principle and its application is measured in failures that no drawing can prevent. Seren sat on the ground outside the cabin, her face streaked with soot, her hands black with it, and she stared at the structure she had spent a week building. It was not useless. The concept was sound, but the execution was wrong, and she did not know enough to know exactly how to fix it. For the first time since they had arrived, she had nothing to say. Kettle stood beside her for a long time without speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was quiet. "You heard grandmother tell stories," he said, "and you thought that was enough to build a stove. You thought stories were the same as knowing how." Seren said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make him wrong. "We have 9 weeks, Kettle continued. 9 weeks before the cold comes, and you just spent one of them building something that nearly killed us." He sat down beside her, and his voice cracked in a way that made him sound younger than 17. "This is not a game, Serene. We do not get to try again and again until we get it right. We get one chance, maybe 2, and you just used one on something that does not work." "I know." "Do you? Because from where I am sitting, it looks like you read a notebook and decided you were an expert. It looks like you would rather die proving a point than admit you do not know what you are doing." The words hit harder than anything Theron had said. Harder because they were true. Harder because they came from the person she was supposed to protect. Harder because Kettle was not being cruel. He was being honest. And his honesty had the sharp, clean edge of something that cuts precisely because it is aimed with love. "We should sell the land," he said. "Take whatever Theron will give us. Go back east. Find work. Find a room. Live." Seren looked at her brother, at the fear in his eyes and the exhaustion, and beneath both of those, the thin, barely visible thread of trust that he was trying so hard not to show. He trusted her. Even now, even after the smoke and the failure and the wasted week, he trusted her enough to be this angry. Because anger was just fear wearing a different face. And his fear was not for himself. It was for her. "No," she said. Kettle stared at her. Then he stood up, brushed the soot from his clothes, and walked away across the prairie without looking back. He did not return until nightfall. When he came back, he did not speak. He lay down on the dirt floor beside her and closed his eyes, and the silence between them was heavier than the clay she had been hauling for 2 weeks. He helped her the next morning, not because he believed in what she was building, but because he was her brother and the alternative was watching her do it alone. He hauled clay. He carried stones. He did not speak more than necessary, and the distance between them, a distance that had nothing to do with the 12 feet of the cabin and everything to do with the trust he was trying to rebuild, remained. Theron came on a night when the moon was high and the prairie was silver with its light. Seren woke to the sound of breaking. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate. The sharp crack of clay being struck, the crumble of dried mud, the steady rhythm of destruction. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving toward the door, Fenrir rising beside her with a low growl building in his chest. The moonlight showed her what she had feared. A figure stood beside her carefully constructed firebox, a heavy stick in his hand. Half of the clay wall she had rebuilt over the past days lay in ruins at his feet. As she watched, he swung again, and another section crumbled. "Stop!" Her voice cut through the night. The figure turned. Moonlight caught his face. "Theron." He smiled. In that smile, she saw everything he wanted her to know. That he could do this whenever he chose, that there was nothing she could do to prevent it, that this land would be his, one way or another. "Looks like your mud pile had an accident," he said. "Shame. All that work gone in a moment." Kettle appeared in the doorway behind her. His confusion gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to a rage that Seren had never seen in him before. His whole body went rigid with it. He took a step forward. Seren caught his arm. "No," she said quietly. "No witnesses, no proof. Nothing we can do that will not make things worse." Theron laughed. "Rebuild if you want," he called over his shoulder as he walked toward his horse. "I will just come back. Or maybe I will not have to. Maybe the cold will do the work for me." He mounted and looked down at them one last time. But before he turned the horse, his eyes dropped to the floor of the cabin, visible through the open door. To the spot near the back wall where loose boards covered the packed earth. His gaze lingered there for a moment, and something moved across his face that was not contempt and not satisfaction. Something that looked, in the silver light, almost like pain. Then he rode away. Seren stood in the yard for a long time after he was gone, looking at the ruins, at the clay that had taken days to shape and dry, at the stones carefully selected and positioned. He knew, she said quietly. What? Kettle was still shaking with anger. He looked at the floor, at the spot where the boards are loose. He knows something is hidden there. It was Kettle who found it the next morning, while clearing debris from the area Theron's eyes had lingered on. Beneath one of the loose boards, in a hollow scraped into the packed earth, a tin box. Inside the box, letters, dozens of them, written in their father's hand, spanning 12 years. Letters addressed to Seren. Letters addressed to Kettle. Letters that had never been sent. My dearest children, the first one began. I have tried to write to you so many times, but my letters are returned. I do not know if your grandmother is keeping them from you, or if something else prevents them from arriving. But I want you to know that I think of you every day. There were letters describing his new life on the prairie. Letters asking about their schooling, their health, their happiness. Letters that grew more desperate as the years passed, and no response came. The final letter was written shortly before his death. If you are reading this, then you have come to claim what I have left you. I hid these letters because I feared Theron would destroy them. He has never accepted you. He believes you are the reason I left his mother, though that is not true. I left because I was a coward, and I have paid for that cowardice every day of my life. The land is yours. The cabin is yours. Everything I have built here is yours. Do not let anyone take it from you. Seren set the letter down. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something had settled in her chest, hard and clear and absolutely certain. He did not forget us, Kettle said quietly. No, he did not. They looked at each other across the small cabin, across the ruins of clay and the scattered stones and the dirt floor that held a dead man's hidden heart. And something shifted between them. The distance that had opened after the failed test began to close. Not because Kettle suddenly believed the clay bed would work, but because he understood now why Seren could not leave. Why selling the land to Theron would be a betrayal not just of their father's will, but of the love that had been written into those letters week after week for 12 years, while the man who wrote them sat alone in this cabin and waited for an answer that never came. Tell me what to do, Kettle said. Help me dig more clay. And this time, when he picked up the shovel, there was something different in the way he held it. Not the mechanical compliance of a person going through motions. Something harder. Something with roots. The woman came 8 days later. She was perhaps 50, gray-haired and strong-boned, with rough hands and a weathered face that told the story of a life spent working outdoors in all seasons. She spoke English with the rounded vowels and soft consonants of someone who had grown up speaking German. I heard about what you are building, she said. Her name was Dagny Vogt, and she had come from a settlement 15 miles to the south. I heard about the mud bed, the fire channels, the whole impossible thing. Did you come to tell me it will not work? I came to tell you that you are doing it wrong. Seren's hands stilled on the clay she had been shaping. Dagny walked past her without asking permission and knelt beside the half-rebuilt structure. She studied it for a long moment, her eyes moving over the firebox, the channels, the arrangement of stones, with the careful attention of someone who was comparing what she saw to something she carried in her memory. "The throat is too narrow," she said finally. "You will choke the draft. Smoke will back up into the channels, and you will never clear it." She pointed to another section. "And here, you have a dead spot. The heat will go around it, not through it. You will have a cold section in the middle of your bed that never warms, no matter how long you burn." These were the exact problems Seren had encountered. The exact failures. Hearing them named by someone else, hearing them identified with the casual precision of someone who recognized them on sight, sent a jolt through her chest that was equal parts hope and humiliation. "How do you know this?" she asked. Dagny looked up at her with eyes that held memories of another place, another time, another life entirely. "My grandmother had a pechka in the old country," she said. "On the river, in the German settlements in the east. I was a child when we left, but I remember it. The way the house stayed warm all night. The way we slept on top of it, my sisters and I, warm as summer, while the snow piled higher than the windows." She stood, brushing clay dust from her hands. "I have never built one myself, but I remember how it was made. And I know enough to see that yours will not work the way you have it now. Can you teach me?" Dagny's eyes were shrewd. The eyes of a woman who had survived by knowing the value of what she carried. "I do not work for free. You will work my fields next spring, you and that brother of yours. 20 days of labor, dawn to dusk, for what I am about to give you. We might not survive to spring. Then you will not owe me anything." Dagny shrugged. "But I think you will survive. I think you have something most of these people have not seen in a long time." "What is that?" "The old stubbornness. The kind that built the villages back home, that crossed an ocean, that broke the prairie when the prairie did not want to be broken. I see it in your eyes." She smiled, and for a moment her weathered face held something like warmth. "Now, let me show you what you are doing wrong." She stayed for 3 hours. She showed Seren where the throat needed to be wider, where the channels needed to turn more gradually instead of making sharp angles that trapped ash and blocked flow, where the clean-out ports should go to allow ash removal without dismantling the whole structure. She showed her how to mix lime with the clay for the final plaster coat, creating a surface that would seal the mass against moisture and prevent the fine cracks that let heat escape and smoke seep through. "The bed must breathe," Dagny said. "Not too fast, not too slow, like a person sleeping. If it breathes wrong, it dies. If it breathes right, it outlives you." She left with a promise that the 20 days of labor would be paid in the spring when planting season came. "If you are alive to pay it," she added, though her voice suggested she thought the odds were better than she was willing to say out loud. Seren rebuilt everything, tore down what remained of the first attempt, and started fresh, incorporating every correction Dagny had given her. The throat wider, the channels curving instead of angling, clean-out ports at each turn. The lime clay plaster mixed in batches and applied in thin layers, each one drying before the next was added. Kettle worked beside her now with a focus that had not been there before. He did not speak about the letters again, but Seren noticed that he carried one in his pocket, folded small, and sometimes, when he thought she was not watching, he would touch it through the fabric of his shirt, the way a man touches a wound, to check whether it is still healing. 3 days after Dagny's visit, another visitor came. He was old, older than anyone Saren had seen on the prairie. His name was Old Halvard, and he walked with a cane carved from oak, and his eyes, though rheumy with age, missed nothing. He was 78 years old, the longest tenured settler anyone knew of in the region. He said nothing at first. He walked past Saren without invitation, the way only a man of his age and certainty would, and placed one weathered hand flat against the surface of the rebuilt clay. He held it there for a long time, his fingers spread wide, as though he were listening to something the clay was saying that no one else could hear. Then he nodded slowly. "My grandmother had one of these," he said, "in Norway. In a village so far north, the sun did not rise for 2 months in winter. She called it by a name I cannot quite remember anymore, but I remember the warmth. I was a boy when I last slept on one, and I never forgot it. The way the cold could not reach you, the way the heat came up from below like the earth itself was holding you. You believe it will work? I know it will work. The question is whether you can finish it before the cold comes." He looked at the sky, at the clouds building in the northwest, at the way the grass moved in a wind that carried something new on its edge. "This winter will be hard, harder than any winter I can remember. And I can remember a great many of them." "How do you know?" "The same way my grandmother knew. The same way the old ones always knew." He tapped his cane against the ground. "The earth tells you if you listen, and the earth is saying that something bad is coming." He left without offering to help, without promising to return. But his words stayed with Saren long after he was gone, settled into her bones alongside the letters and the clay dust, and the growing certainty that she was running out of time. She worked faster after that, through the nights, incorporating everything Dagny had shown her. The lime plaster went on in careful layers. The channels were tested with small fires, each one burning hotter than the last, each one sending smoke through the maze inside the clay a little more smoothly, a little more completely. By the middle of autumn, the heated bed was as finished as she could make it. It rose 18 inches from the floor, a clay platform 5 feet wide by 7 feet long, its surface smooth with lime plaster, its edges rounded to prevent chipping. Beneath the surface ran 3 channels that snaked the full length of the platform before rising to meet the chimney pipe she had bought in the settlement a lifetime ago. The firebox occupied one corner, lined with flat stones and broken bricks that Dagny had brought on her second visit. The throat was wide enough now to draw a strong flame. The ash pit was accessible through a small door fashioned from a flattened tin can. It looked like something out of a fever dream, a massive clay structure taking up nearly a quarter of the cabin's floor space, dominating the room with its bulk, promising either salvation or disaster. On a cold morning, when the first frost had already come and gone, 3 weeks earlier than anyone had predicted, Saren lit a fire in the finished firebox. Kindling first, then dry branches, then the kind of fuel that burned hot and fast. The fire caught. It grew. Smoke curled into the throat and disappeared. She held her breath, listening for the sound of clay protesting, watching for smoke backing up through the channels. Nothing. The chimney drew, The smoke traveled through the invisible maze inside the platform, depositing its heat into the mass at every turn. She could hear it, a faint whisper of moving air, of warmth being captured and held. 1 hour passed. She pressed her palm to the surface, cool at first, but not cold. Something warmer entering the mass, beginning its slow migration through the clay. 2 hours passed. The surface was warm to the touch, not hot. She could hold her hand against it comfortably, but warm. Warmer than the air, warmer than anything else in the cabin. Kettle moved closer. He touched the clay, pulled his hand back in surprise, touched it again. "It is warm," he said. "I know, but the fire is almost out. That is the point." He looked at her with something new in his eyes. Not quite belief, not yet, but the beginning of possibility. The first crack in the wall of doubt. 3 hours. The fire had died to embers barely visible through the grate. But the clay held its warmth, steady, constant, releasing heat at a rate a body could absorb without burning. "Get on," Seren said. "What?" "Get on the bed. Let us see if it works." Kettle climbed onto the platform, lay down, went absolutely still. His face changed, the tension draining out of it. The cold tightened muscles relaxing for the first time in days. "It is warm," he said again. But this time the words held wonder instead of surprise. "It is actually warm." Seren climbed up beside him. Fenrir scrambled up after her, his wounded leg healed now, but still moving with careful habit. The three of them lay on the heated clay while the autumn cold pressed against the cabin walls, and for the first time since they had arrived, they were not cold. The first test had passed. But the first test was not the real test. The real test would come with the deep cold. The killing cold. The cold that did not lift for days and froze men standing upright and killed children in their sleep. That cold was coming. She could feel it in the wind that pressed against the cabin walls, could see it in the gray sky that promised nothing but winter, could hear it in old Halvard's words, still echoing. The earth is saying that something bad is coming. Seren lay on the warm clay with her brother beside her and her dog at her feet, and she looked up at the ceiling of the cabin, at the chimney pipe that now carried smoke instead of letting in sky, and she allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite hope. Something smaller and more honest. The feeling of having built a thing with her own hands that worked the way it was supposed to work. Then the moment passed, and the worry came back, because the real test was still ahead. And the real test did not care about moments. The real test cared about mass and heat and the brutal arithmetic of cold, and whether a pile of mud built by a 19-year-old girl who had learned everything she knew from a dead woman's notebook would be enough to keep the people she loved alive through whatever was coming. The answer would not be long in arriving. Winter came the way a fist closes, slowly at first, the fingers curling inward one by one, and then all at once, the grip complete, the cold total. By the time the first heavy snow fell, Seren had sealed every gap in the cabin walls she could find. Rags stuffed into cracks, clay packed into the spaces between boards, a piece of oilcloth tacked over the cracked window to cut the draft. None of it was enough to make the cabin warm. Not the air, not the space between the walls. The air inside was still cold enough to see her breath even at midday. But the clay bed was a different country. The clay bed was summer trapped in earth, warmth stored in mass, heat that rose through the platform and met her body and held it the way the ground holds a seed through the frozen months. Patient, steady, waiting. She burned her fires twice a day, morning and evening, an hour each time. Small fires, hot fires, the kind that sent the exhaust racing through the channels at a temperature high enough to transfer real heat into the clay before escaping up the chimney. The clay drank it. The clay held it. And through the long nights, when the temperature outside fell below zero and the wind found every weakness in the walls, the surface beneath their bodies stayed warm. They slept on the platform, Seren and Kettle and Fenrir between them. The dog had grown into his new life the way only a creature who has known the worst can grow into something better. With gratitude that showed in every gesture, in the way he pressed his body against Seren's legs at night, in the way his one good eye tracked her across the room with an attention that was not anxiety, but devotion. His coat was thick now, healthy, the gray-black fur glossy with the nutrition of scraps that Seren could barely spare, but could not bring herself to withhold. His bad leg had healed completely, though he still favored it on cold mornings, a habit of caution that his body remembered even when the pain was gone. The neighbors watched. Osmond Dahl drove his wagon past the edge of their claim and noted the thin trail of smoke from their chimney, much thinner than the heavy columns that rose from the iron stoves of every other homestead in the region. He did not stop. He did not offer help. He simply observed and drove on. And Seren could feel his observation the way she could feel the cold, as a pressure, constant and patient, waiting for the failure he was certain would come. The whispers reached her through the network of gossip that connected every farm and homestead. She is building a coffin for herself and that brother of hers. 2 city children playing with mud while winter sharpens its teeth. Theron says they will not last until the new year. Osmond says, not even that long. She let them whisper. The clay was dry. The channels were clear. The firebox drew strong. And every night she pressed her hand to the surface of the bed and felt the warmth that everyone said was impossible. The letter from the court came on a day when the sky was the color of iron and the snow lay thick across the prairie. A rider from the settlement brought it, a legal document that turned her stomach cold before she opened it. Theron was suing to invalidate the will. He claimed their father had been of unsound mind, that the witnesses had been coerced, that the children from the first marriage had no legal standing to inherit property that belonged by rights to the family who had worked the land. The court date was set for spring. If they lost, they would lose everything. The cabin, the land, the clay bed she had built with her own hands. Kettle read the letter 3 times. "We need a lawyer," he said. "With what money? We have $7. $7 and some cents. That will not pay for an hour." Seren took the letter from his hands and set it aside. "We survive the winter first," she said. "Then we deal with the court." Kettle looked at her for a long time. "You really think we can win?" Seren thought about her grandmother, who had crossed an ocean with nothing but knowledge and stubbornness. She thought about her father, who had written letters every week for 12 years to children who never answered. She thought about the clay beneath her hands, warm and solid, holding heat the way she was trying to hold on to everything she had left. "I think we have to try," she said. "I think anything else is already giving up." Kettle nodded slowly. Then he climbed onto the heated bed, lay down, and closed his eyes. "Wake me if the world ends," he said. Seren sat by the window and watched the snow fall, and she did not sleep at all. The morning began with a lie. The temperature at dawn was warmer than it had been in weeks, warm enough that the frost on the inside of the window had begun to melt, leaving trails of water that caught the early light. The sky was pale and clean. The wind was soft. Seren stood in the doorway of the cabin and breathed deep. The air felt almost gentle, the kind of breath the winter sometimes took between storms, a pause that could make a person believe the worst was over. The old-timers called it a false thaw, a gift that was not a gift, a door that opened only to show you what was waiting on the other side. Kettle was already outside. His first time beyond the cabin walls in weeks. He stood in the yard with his face turned up to the pale sun, and he was smiling. The smile transformed him. It took the worry from his face and the tension from his shoulders, and made him look, for just a moment, like the boy he had been before any of this had happened. "It feels like spring," he said. "It is not spring. I know. But it feels like it." Fenrir bounded through the softening snow, his bad leg forgotten, his body electric with the joy of movement and open air. He chased something invisible through the drifts, his one good eye bright, his tail high, and watching him run made Seren's chest ache with a tenderness she did not have time to examine. She needed firewood. There was a fallen cottonwood 1/2 mile to the west, dry and brittle, perfect for the hot, fast burns the clay bed demanded. She took her hatchet and a length of rope. "Watch Fenrir," she told Kettle. "Do not let him wander too far." She walked out across the prairie. The snow crunched beneath her boots, but was not deep enough to slow her. The sky was clear, pale winter blue, empty of everything except light. She worked for an hour, chopping branches, bundling them, the rhythm of the hatchet steady and familiar, a sound that belonged to this life now, to this version of herself that she was still learning to recognize. She filled her arms, tied the bundle, and turned to start home. That was when she saw the sky. The clouds had come from the northwest. They were moving faster than any clouds she had ever seen, a wall of color that swallowed the horizon as it advanced. The color was wrong. Not the white gray of ordinary snow, not the dark gray of thunder. This was the color of a bruise, yellow-brown, sick-looking, the color of something that should not exist in a sky. The wind died. That was what frightened her most. The wind on the prairie never stopped completely. It was as constant as breathing, a background presence so familiar that its absence felt like deafness. But for a long, terrible span of seconds, the air went absolutely still. No movement, no sound, nothing but the bruised sky advancing, and the silence that preceded it, like the silence before a scream. Then the wind returned. It did not build. It did not rise from breeze to gust to gale the way winds are supposed to rise. It arrived all at once, a solid wall of moving air that hit her like a physical blow, staggering her sideways, ripping the bundle of wood from her grip. Snow that had not been falling a second before filled her eyes, her nose, her mouth, driven horizontal by a force that seemed less like weather and more like something alive, something with intent she could not see. The world had turned white. Not the white of snow falling gently, but a featureless, white void that erased distance, direction, every landmark she might have used to find her way. The cold came with the wind, not gradually, but instantly. A plunge so sudden she could feel it happening to her skin in real time. The exposed flesh of her face going from comfortable to painful to numb in the space of a dozen heartbeats. She ran. She did not know if she was running toward the cabin or away from it. She could not see her own feet. The snow was not falling. It was horizontal, driven by a wind that screamed in frequencies she had never heard. A sound like tearing metal, like something enormous being destroyed just beyond the edge of sight. She ran because standing still meant death. Because movement was the only thing left. Because somewhere in this white void was her brother, her cabin, her dog, everything she had built, and she had to reach them or die in the space between. Time lost its shape. Direction lost its meaning. There was only the white, the cold, the wind, and the desperate rhythm of her legs driving forward. The cabin materialized from nothing. One moment only white, the next a dark shape, a corner of tar paper, the familiar outline of the only home she had. She slammed into the wall, felt along it with frozen hands, found the door, wrenched it open against a wind that fought to keep it closed. Inside, warmth. The clay bed still radiating heat from the morning fire. A warmth so startling after the violence of what she had just come through that her legs buckled and she nearly fell. Kettle was there. His face was white. Fenrir was not. He chased a rabbit into the grass, Kettle said. The wind came too fast. He could not find his way back. The rope was coiled by the door. She had put it there months ago, a precaution she hoped would never be needed. She tied one end to the door handle with fingers that had already lost feeling, and wrapped the other end around her wrist. Kettle grabbed her arm. "No, Saren, you cannot go back out there." She pulled free and went back into the white. The wind tried to tear her from the earth. The snow tried to bury her standing. Every breath was a fight. Every step a negotiation with a force that wanted her to stop, to lie down, to let the white swallow her the way it was swallowing everything else. She let out rope as she moved, the lifeline unspooling behind her, her only connection to the cabin that had already vanished. 10 feet. 15. 20. The rope burned against her wrist where the wind pulled at it. She swept her arms through the snow in wide arcs, feeling for anything solid, anything warm, anything that was not wind and ice and emptiness. 25 feet. The rope was almost gone. Then she heard it. A whimper, thin and high, barely audible above the roar. She dropped to her knees. Her hands found fur, a body curled tight against the frozen ground, a heart still beating against her palms. Fenrir. His one good eye was closed. His limbs were stiff. His breath came in shallow gasps that frosted the air between them. She scooped him into her arms and turned back toward the cabin. Hand over hand along the rope, her fingers too numb to grip properly, the weight of the dog pulling her forward and down with every step. The door appeared out of the white. Kettle dragged them both inside and slammed it shut behind them. She stripped the ice from Fenrir's fur and pressed him against the warm clay surface, wrapping him in every blanket she could find. His body was limp, his breathing shallow, but the clay was warm beneath him, and warmth was what he needed, and she had warmth to give. The cabin was not empty, and it was not quiet. While she had been out in the storm, someone had pounded on the door again. Kettle had opened it. Osmond Dahl stood in the middle of the room, snow caked in his beard, his massive frame hunched against the cold. In his arms, wrapped in a frost-covered blanket, was a small bundle that Serene's mind refused to process for a long, horrible second before it resolved into what it was. A child. A little girl. 4 years old, with lips that had turned blue and skin that had gone the color of candle wax. Solvi. Osmond's granddaughter. The only grandchild he had left. Saren looked at Kettle. Her brother's face told her everything she needed to know. He had heard the pounding on the door while she was gone. He had opened it. He had let Osmond in, this man who had told them they would freeze, who had driven past their cabin a dozen times without stopping, who had called their clay bed a coffin. Kettle had not hesitated. He had opened the door and pulled them inside and built up the fire in the firebox with the same hands that had hauled clay all summer. And by the time Seren crashed through the door, with ice in her hair and terror in her chest, the cabin was already doing what it had been built to do. She did not ask questions. She did not remind Osmond of the things he had said. She took the child from his arms, stripped away the frozen blankets, wrapped her in dry ones, and laid her on the heated clay. "More wood," she said to Kettle. "Keep the fire burning, hot and fast. Everything we have." Kettle moved. He was 17 years old, and he moved with the focus and precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and exactly what needed to be done. He grabbed kindling from the box by the door. He grabbed matches from the tin on the shelf. He opened the firebox and arranged the wood the way he had watched his sister do it 100 times, the way that let air flow, the way that let flames build. The match caught. The fire grew. The clay began to drink the heat. Solvi did not wake, but she was breathing. Shallow breaths, fragile breaths, but breaths all the same. And Seren watched the rise and fall of the blanket over the child's chest, the way a sailor watches a horizon for land. The blue faded from the girl's lips. White replaced it. Then, slowly, pink crept back into her skin, like color returning to a photograph that had been left too long in the sun. Osmond stood in the corner of the cabin. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, diminished, as though the storm had stripped away not just warmth, but something structural, some load-bearing wall inside him that had been holding up the architecture of his certainty. He watched his granddaughter with eyes that held a terror Seren recognized because she had felt it herself. The terror of almost losing the only thing that matters. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and he was not a man who wasted words on inadequacy. More came. Berger Holm arrived an hour later, his wife and 2 grandchildren clinging to him like survivors of a shipwreck. His iron stove had consumed his entire winter wood supply in 2 days. He had started burning fence posts on the second night, then furniture, then anything that would ignite. The heat had poured out of his stove and into the air, and through the walls and into the storm, and the storm had swallowed it, the way the prairie swallows rain, completely, instantly, without acknowledgement. He had nothing left to burn, and the cold was not finished. Ebby Rask came alone. The young man who had bet money that Saren would be dead before the new year. His right hand was white and rigid with frostbite, the fingers locked in a half-curl that he held against his chest like something broken and irreplaceable. He said nothing when he came through the door. He looked at the clay bed, at the warmth radiating from its surface, at the people already lying on it, and his face underwent a transformation that Saren would remember for the rest of her life. The transformation of a man who realizes that the thing he mocked is the thing that will save him. Reverend Grinda came last. The preacher who had warned his congregation about pagan knowledge, about heathen techniques that had no place in a God-fearing community. He brought nothing but himself, and a prayer he was too exhausted to speak, and a humility that sat on his shoulders like a garment he had never worn before and did not know how to adjust. 11 people in a cabin built for 2. They lay together on the heated clay, sharing space, sharing warmth, sharing the heat that radiated from the mass beneath them. Saren fed the fire every 2 hours, small hot burns that the clay absorbed and released slowly, steadily, throughout the long night. She measured the firewood with her eyes and calculated how long it would last, and tried not to think about what would happen if the storm outlasted their supply. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say that the wind was not already sane, screaming its intentions against the walls, promising death to anyone foolish enough to challenge it. But inside, the clay held. The warmth held. The people who had called her a fool lay breathing on the bed she had built with her own hands, and they did not die. The storm did not end. It settled in like a living thing, like something that had decided this stretch of prairie belonged to it now. The wind did not rise and fall the way ordinary storms behave. It simply screamed, hour after hour, shaking the walls with a violence that made the shelves rattle and the doorframe groan. Saren did not sleep. She could not. Every hour brought a new crisis, a gust that sounded like it would tear the roof away, a crack in the wall that admitted a blade of cold air, which she stuffed with rags and cloth and anything that could block it. A moment when the fire burned low, and the temperature in the cabin dropped fast enough to wake the sleeping. But the clay held. She pressed her hand to its surface every hour, tracking the warmth, measuring the slow release. The fire burned hot for 30 minutes at a time. Then she let it die to coals while the mass took over. The surface stayed warm. The people stayed alive. She thought about her neighbors. Osmond, whose iron stove ate wood like a starving animal. Birger, whose larger house and larger family demanded more fuel than any reasonable person could stockpile. all of them burning through their winter supplies at a pace that assumed storms lasted hours. This storm was not lasting hours. On the second night, Solvi woke. Her eyes opened slowly, confused, frightened. She looked around at the strange cabin, the strange faces, the one-eyed dog who lay at the foot of the clay bed, watching over everyone with the patient vigilance of an animal who understood, on some level beyond language, that his job was to guard these people the way the clay guarded their warmth. "Grandpa," the girl whispered. Osmond moved to her side, his weathered face transformed, relief so profound it looked almost like pain. "I was cold," Solvi said. "I know. You are warm now." The girl's eyes drifted to Fenrir, who had lifted his head at the sound of her voice. His tail moved once against the clay surface, a slow sweep that said he had been waiting for her to wake up, and was glad she finally had. "Can I pet the dog?" she asked. The question was so ordinary, so perfectly childlike, so completely untouched by the horror of everything that had happened in the last 2 days, that several people laughed. The sound was startling in the small cabin, rusty and awkward, like machinery that had not been used in too long, and was surprised to find itself still functional. Fenrir seemed to understand what was being asked of him. He rose from his spot at the foot of the bed and padded over to the little girl and lay down beside her and rested his head near her hand. Solvi stroked his fur, and her fingers found the scarred socket where his missing eye had been, and she touched it with the gentle curiosity of a child who does not yet know that damage is supposed to be ugly. "What is his name?" she asked. "Fenrir," Serene said. "Like in the stories?" "Like in the stories. He only has one eye, but he sees more with one than most see with two." Solvi smiled, the first smile anyone had seen since the storm began. She went on petting the dog, and for a moment, just a moment, the storm outside ceased to exist. There was only a little girl and a one-eyed dog, and the warmth of clay built by hands that everyone had said were foolish. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Osmond watched from the corner. His jaw was tight, working against something that might have been grief, or might have been gratitude, or might have been the first movement of a realization that would take him days to fully accept. That he had been wrong. Not about small things, not about details, but about everything. About what was possible, about who knew what, about whether a 19-year-old girl from back east could build something in mud and stone that would do what 15 years of iron and experience could not. The realization moved across his face like weather crossing the prairie. Slow, visible, impossible to stop. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. Saren woke to silence. Not the exhausted pause of a storm gathering itself for another assault, but true silence. Deep silence. The silence of aftermath. Of something enormous that had finally finished what it came to do and moved on. The wind had stopped. The snow had stopped. The world outside the window, when she scraped the frost away to look, was white and still and utterly transformed. The drifts against the cabin reached the roof on the north side. The door opened only 6 inches before hitting a wall of packed snow. She spent an hour digging a path to open air, her arms aching, her lungs burning in the cold that remained even though the wind had died. When she finally broke through, she stood in the narrow trench and looked out at the prairie. The land had been erased. Every familiar landmark, the fence posts, the stone pile at the corner of her claim, the distant line of trees along the creek. Everything buried beneath a white blankness that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The world was new, empty, silent, as though everything that had existed before the storm had been a rough draft, and the storm had wiped it clean to start again. But she was not dead. Her brother was not dead. The 11 people in her cabin were not dead. The one-eyed dog who had followed her into a storm to save his life was not dead. And the clay was still warm. She pressed her hand against the surface of the bed one more time, the way she had pressed it every hour for 3 days, the way she would press it every morning for years to come. The warmth rose to meet her palm, steady, patient, faithful. Heat that had been captured from fire and stored in earth and released into the bodies of people who had called it impossible. The earth remembered. The earth always remembered. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out at the white world, and she breathed, and the air was so cold it hurt her lungs. And she breathed again anyway, because breathing was what the living did. And she was alive, and her people were alive, and the clay had held, and the earth had remembered, and the grandmother who had carried this knowledge across an ocean had not carried it in vain. Behind her, Fenrir appeared in the doorway. He sat beside her and looked out at the snow with his one good eye, and his tail swept once across the threshold, and the silence of the prairie stretched around them like a held breath, like the space between one heartbeat and the next, like the pause that comes after a story that is not over, but has reached the place where the telling must rest before it can continue. The storm was gone. The winter was not finished, but the worst had passed, and they had passed through it. And now came the part that Sirin had not planned for, and could not have predicted. The part where the world responds to what you have survived. The part where the people who doubted you must decide what to do with the evidence of their own wrongness. That part, she would learn, was harder than the storm. But not yet. For now, she stood in the doorway with her dog beside her, and the warmth of the clay at her back, and the white silence of the prairie stretching before her. And she allowed herself, for the first time since summer, to feel something that was not fear. It was not triumph. It was not pride. It was something quieter than either of those. Something that lived closer to the bone. It was the feeling of having kept a promise she had made to a dead woman's notebook in the darkest hour of a night when the cold was total and the doubt was total, and the only thing that was not total was the warmth rising from the earth beneath her body. The news came in fragments over the following days, carried by neighbors who had survived, who broke paths through drifts that reached their shoulders, who checked on the living and counted the dead with the grim efficiency of people who had done this before and hoped never to do it again. The stories were terrible. A family had run out of fuel on the second night and been found frozen together in their bed, their iron stove cold and empty, their arms still wrapped around each other. A man had gone to his barn to check on his cattle, and never returned. His wife found his body 12 feet from the door, facing the wrong direction, turned around by the white, frozen in mid-step as though the cold had simply pressed a finger against him and said, "Stop." Children who had been walking home when the sky changed had wandered in circles until their legs gave out. The snow had buried them so deeply that some would not be found until the thaw, when the ground released what the storm had taken. Seren heard these stories and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The dead were dead, and no amount of words would warm them now. She could only stand in the doorway of the cabin she had kept alive and feel the weight of survival settle on her shoulders like a coat she had not asked to wear but could not take off. Birger Holm came on the 4th day. He stood outside the cabin with his hat in his hands and said 4 words. "How does it work?" Seren told him. The firebox, the channels, the mass, the slow release. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, his jaw tightened. 3 days of the worst cold anyone could remember, and she had burned a quarter cord. His iron stove had devoured 4. "My nephew nearly died," he said. "His stove ate everything he had." "Send him to me," Seren said. "I will teach him." Birger looked at her for a long moment. "I am sorry," he said, "for what I said, for what I thought, for all of it." He put his hat back on. "That is not nothing coming from me." "I know," Seren said. He walked away through the snow. Osmond Dahl came on the 6th day. She was outside clearing snow from the chimney when she saw his wagon approaching from the east, moving slowly through the broken paths that neighbors had carved through the drifts. He climbed down with the stiffness of a man whose body had absorbed too many cold mornings and too much grief, and too many winters of being right about things that did not matter as much as he thought they did. "I need to say something," he said, "and it is not going to be easy. So I am just going to say it." Seren set down her shovel and waited. "I told you that you would freeze. I told you that your brother would freeze with you. I told everyone in this county that you were a fool building a coffin, that you would be dead before the snow melted. I told them your mud bed would crack and your channels would clog, and you would poison yourself in your sleep." He paused. His chest heaved with the effort of what he was saying, as though the words had physical weight, and he was lifting each one by hand. "I was wrong about all of it, and I am standing here alive today because you did not listen to me, because you kept building while everyone laughed, because when my granddaughter was dying, you let me in and put her on your clay and saved her life." He met her eyes. "I have lived on this prairie for 15 years. I buried my wife here. I buried my daughter here. I thought I knew everything there was to know about surviving the cold. I thought experience was the only teacher that mattered." He stopped, drew a breath that shook on the way in. "I was wrong about that too. Sometimes the old ways know things that experience has forgotten. Sometimes a 19-year-old girl from back east knows more than a man who has been here twice as long as she has been alive." Seren stood in the snow and felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, something else entirely. Recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement. The sense that her grandmother's knowledge, carried across an ocean and through 3 generations, had finally found a place where it could stop traveling and take root. "Thank you," she said. "That means more than you know." Osmond nodded once. Then, because he was not a man who lingered over emotional moments, he turned back to his wagon. "I will stand up in the church next Sunday and say what I just said to you. My word carries weight in this county. People listen when I talk. Then they will listen when I tell them I was wrong." He climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins. "You are going to have a lot of teaching to do," he said. "I know. Good." He flicked the reins. "His granddaughter wants to visit the dog, by the way. She has been asking about him every day since the storm." Sarin looked at Fenrir, who had appeared in the cabin doorway to watch the conversation with the calm attention of an animal who understood more than he should have been able to understand. "Fenrir is here whenever she wants to come," she said. "That is a good dog," Osmond said. "He saved me as much as I saved him." "Usually works that way." He drove away through the snow, and Sarin stood in the cold and watched him go. And she allowed herself, for the second time since the storm, to feel something that was not fear. The court day came on the first clear morning after the thaw. The room was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, faces crowded at the windows. Word had spread through the county about the 2 orphans from back east, about the clay bed that had saved 11 lives, about the lawsuit that would determine whether they kept their father's land. Theron sat on one side with a lawyer from the nearest city, a thin man with thin lips and a voice that rustled like paper. He had prepared documents, witnesses, arguments. He had the weight of local history and local assumptions on his side. Sarin and Kettle sat on the other side, alone. They could not afford a lawyer. They had prepared nothing but the truth. The judge listened, while Theron's lawyer made his case. Unsound mind, invalid will, rightful heirs displaced by strangers who had no connection to the land. Then the judge turned to Sarin. "You have heard the claims. What do you have to say?" Sarin stood. Her hands were steady. Her voice was clear. "Our father left us this land in his will. It was written and witnessed, and there is no evidence he was of unsound mind when he signed it. But that is not what this case is really about." She looked at Theron. "This case is about whether 2 children from back east have a right to what their father left them. This case is about whether Theron Lindmark can take what does not belong to him, simply because he was here first." The courtroom was silent. "Theron took the stove from our father's cabin before we arrived," she continued. "He left us with nothing. No heat, no furniture, no tools. He believed we would die. He came to our cabin in the middle of the night and destroyed the structure we were building to survive. He wanted us to fail." Theron's lawyer started to object. The judge silenced him with a look. "I cannot prove that last accusation in a court of law," Sarin said. "But I know it happened. And so does he." She turned back to the judge. "We survived the winter. We survived the worst storm anyone can remember. And we did it with a heating system that Theron tried to destroy. If you want proof that we have earned our place on this land, Ask the 11 people who sheltered in our cabin. Ask them whether we deserve to stay." The judge looked out at the courtroom. "Is Osmond Dahl here?" Osmond rose from his seat near the back. His granddaughter Solvi was with him, holding his hand with the casual certainty of a child who trusts that the person attached to the other end of her grip will keep her safe no matter what. "You sheltered in the Lindmark cabin during the storm." "I did. Me and my granddaughter." "Tell the court what happened." Osmond turned to face the room. He was not a man accustomed to public speaking, but his voice carried the way his voice always carried, with the weight of a person who does not waste words and therefore makes every word count. "My house ran out of wood on the second night," he said. "My stove was eating it faster than I could replace it. By the time I realized the trouble, it was too late to go anywhere. My granddaughter was turning blue. I thought she was going to die." He paused. The courtroom was absolutely still. "I went to the Lindmark cabin because I had nowhere else to go. I had spent 5 months telling everyone in this county that the girl was building a coffin, that her mud bed would fail, that she would be dead before the year turned. I laughed at her. I mocked her. I told her to her face that she was a fool." His voice caught. Not dramatically, not for effect. The way a voice catches when the throat tightens against something the heart needs to say and the pride does not want to release. "She let me in anyway. She put my Solvi on her clay bed and saved her life. She saved all of us. 11 people in a cabin built for 2, and every one of us survived because of the thing I said would never work." He looked at Theron. "I do not know what the law says about wills and inheritance, but I know what I saw. I know what that girl built with her own hands. And I know the man sitting over there took her stove and left her to die. She survived anyway. If that does not prove she belongs here, I do not know what would." He returned to his seat. Birger Holm stood without being called. His testimony was shorter, but carried the same weight, the same admission, the same quiet, difficult truth that a man had been wrong about everything and was saying so in a room full of people who had believed him. The judge turned to Theron. "Do you have anything to add?" Theron's face was pale. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, but Theron pushed him away. He started to speak. His mouth opened, and the anger was right there, ready. The same anger he had carried since the day he realized his father loved absent children more than the present one. But then he stopped. The silence lasted a long time, long enough for the people in the courtroom to shift in their seats, long enough for Seren to see something move across his face that she had only glimpsed once before, on the night he destroyed her clay wall, and his eyes had lingered on the place where the letters were hidden. He was not thinking about the land. He was not thinking about the will, or the stove, or the lawsuit. He was thinking about the letters. About a man who sat across the table from his own son every morning for 15 years and never wrote him a single word, while pouring his heart into pages addressed to children 1,000 miles away. Theron said nothing. He stood. He gathered his papers. He walked toward the door. As he passed Seren, he slowed but did not stop. He did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply walked through the door and out of the courtroom and into the spring morning, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was quiet and final. Seren never saw him again. She would think about him sometimes in the years that followed. Think about the wound he carried that was the mirror of her own. A father's love traveling in the wrong direction, leaving wreckage on both sides. She did not forgive him exactly. Forgiveness would have required a conversation that never happened. But she understood him. And understanding, she learned, is sometimes the only grace available when forgiveness is not. The judge ruled in their favor. The land was theirs. Spring came late that year. The snow melted slowly, as though the earth needed time to recover from what had been done to it. But as the ground thawed and the grass began to push through the mud, something else began to grow. Throughout the county, people started to build. Clay beds like the ones Seren had made. Heated platforms that could warm a family through the coldest night on a fraction of the fuel an iron stove demanded. Osmond's nephew built one first, following instructions Seren provided. Then Berger built one in his barn for his animals. Then Ebby Rask. Then a dozen others. Seren taught them all. She charged nothing, asked for nothing in return. When they offered payment, she told them to teach someone else. My grandmother did not charge me to learn, she said when people asked why she gave the knowledge away. She just taught. That is how the old knowledge survives, not by being sold, by being given. The knowledge spread the way water spreads across flat ground, finding its own level, its own path, moving outward from one small cabin to farms and homesteads across the region. And each person who learned carried the knowledge forward, and each person they taught carried it further. And the chain of transmission that had begun in a valley in Norway and crossed an ocean in a leather notebook continued to lengthen, link by link, life by life. Winter by winter, Kettle stayed. He worked the land with a steadiness that surprised no one who had watched him change over the course of that winter. From a frightened boy who wanted to sell everything and run, to a young man who understood what it meant to have ground beneath his feet that belonged to him. He and Thyra Rask, the quiet girl who had sat beside her brother Ebba in the courtroom, began to exchange the kind of glances that do not require explanation and do not benefit from commentary. Whatever grew between them grew the way the prairie grass grew. Slowly, naturally, in its own time. Fenrir aged the way good dogs age, gracefully and without complaint. His gray-black fur turned silver around the muzzle. His bad legs stiffened on cold mornings, a reminder of the wire and the wound, and the girl who had knelt in the grass and freed him. He followed Seren everywhere, as he always had, a one-eyed shadow who saw more with his single eye than most creatures saw with two. On cold evenings, he lay on the clay bed, the original one, in the cabin that Seren could never bring herself to abandon, and he watched the fire in the firebox with the steady attention of an animal who understood that fire was warmth, and warmth was life, and life was the thing you held onto with everything you had. On the last warm evening before the first frost of a later autumn, Seren sat outside the cabin in a chair Kettle had built for her. Fenrir lay at her feet, his breathing slow and easy, his eye half closed against the slanting light. The prairie stretched before them, gold turning amber in the fading sun, the grass moving in a wind that carried the smell of earth and distance, and the memory of every season that had come and gone since a girl with a leather notebook and $22 had stepped off a wagon and looked at a cabin with a hole in its roof and decided to fill it. She reached down and rested her hand on Fenrir's head. His tail moved once against the ground, a slow, contented sweep that said everything was exactly as it should be. She thought about her grandmother, who had carried knowledge across an ocean because she believed it was worth carrying. She thought about her father, who had written letters every week for 12 years because he believed love was worth sending even when it was never received. She thought about Theron, who had carried a wound he did not choose and could not put down, and who had walked out of a courtroom and into a life she would never know anything about, and whether he ever found what he was looking for. She thought about the clay bed inside the cabin, still solid after all this time, still warm when the fire was lit, still doing what it had been built to do, which was the same thing her grandmother's knowledge had always done, which was the same thing her father's letters had always tried to do. Hold the heat. Keep the warmth. Remember what matters. Long after the fire goes out. She looked at the sky. The clouds in the northwest were building, the way they always built before a change in the weather. Another winter was coming. Another season of cold and wind and the long, dark nights when the only thing between a body and the frozen earth was what you chose to build and what you chose to remember. Seren was not afraid. She stood, opened the cabin door, and knelt beside the clay bed. She placed her hand flat against the surface, the way she had placed it 1,000 times before. The way she had placed it on that first October morning when the warmth rose to meet her palm and proved that everything her grandmother had told her was true. The clay was cool now. The fire had not been lit today. But beneath the surface, deep in the mass where the channels ran, there was something. Not heat exactly. Something older than heat. Something patient. The memory of every fire that had ever burned inside it, stored in the earth, the way a river stores the memory of every rain that ever fell into its watershed. She struck a match. The kindling caught. The fire grew, and the clay began to warm, the way it always had, the way it always would, long after she was gone, and the cabin was gone, and the prairie had reclaimed every human thing that had ever been built upon it. The earth remembered. The earth would always remember. And that was enough.